Hi.
Hello. Thank you, everyone, for having us. I am Anna. I am a transgender person. First and foremost, that's going to be the most important thing. My pronouns are she, her, and they, their. I am also the co-host of the Transgenda podcast, and I am the co-chair of the Trans Northland organization. This is Phillips.
And I'm Cam, Anna's dad. I also am the co-host of the Transgenda podcast and a nonprofit consultant and professor of organizational leadership. And just a little background on our podcast. We started the podcast 3 years ago as just an opportunity for Anna and I to talk. We both were moving out of our house, into separate places. We'd always been very close, and we decided that we wanted to start a podcast, and we never thought anybody would ever listen to it. And here we are 3 years later. We have 100,000 listeners all throughout the world, with weird pockets in like New Zealand and England, and lots of folks in Minnesota. And we have really loved the opportunity to engage and talk about Anna's experience and mine as a cisgender man who didn't know anything about gender nonconformity until we started this process. And so this has been a big journey for us.
Really has been.
We're also the official training providers for Trans Northland, which is how we became part of this training.
Gosh, the clicker is very sensitive. All right, so why does this matter? Well, so a lot of people, when they are like, oh, a trans training, like, what am I really going to learn? I know some trans people. I'm an ally. And I love that point. I love that people are like, I'm an ally. I support the trans people. I know some trans people. And then, of course, I throw it on the ground. Oh, my gosh.
Okay, I dumped coffee in the earlier training on a laptop, so I totally know.
Okay. Use more responsible with it, I guess. So, the biggest thing when it comes to learning about trans people is hearing from trans people. And so why does this matter? Well, it's because trans people have existed everywhere throughout history. We have evidence of trans people from before written history. Stories, oral histories have talked about trans people for millennia. We're also under attack. I don't know, we're kind of getting into the current of political climate and stuff, but there is a lot of discourse around trans people and our rights and who we are and what we're allowed to do and things like that. And we're not going to get into political ideologies or anything here, but I do want to just bring that up, that we are under attack by people pretty much all the time. Even when it's not like in the mainstream news, it's not being talked about openly, we are still being under attack.
And like so many things, we want you to approach this from this perspective of, regardless of your political alignment, your job is the patient comes first, right? And how to support them best in their medical and mental needs is going to be a big part of your work. But understanding, too, that because trans people are under attack, they're coming to you on the defense quite often, that their experiences are not going to be valued and that they're not going to be treated as human beings. And so we want to give you some tools in order to better support people who are experiencing trauma just from the world around them.
I just also want to mention something that I did forget to mention. If you are listening to the Zoom recording, you'll want to head over to the Education Department Zoom, not to the Transgenda Zoom, because we have the presentation, so that can be documented too here. But trans-friendly spaces help everyone. Does anybody have any ideas about what I mean by that? Who here likes to use a public restroom? Wow, a couple of people with like some mixed responses.
One of those public restrooms.
I need to.
I mean, here's the thing. Like, I'm not necessarily talking about the concept of restrooms in public. That's a good idea. I'm more talking about like who wants to go and pee next to a stranger. Nobody, really.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. So
we do like the availability of a place to pee if you need to, right?
Which, just so everybody's aware, is also something that they are trying to restrict from trans people. Like, oftentimes they're like, no, you can't pee in public, right? Because you either have to use the bathroom that is your assigned sex at birth, which really doesn't mean anything, or you don't get to pee. And so I love the availability of public restrooms. I just hate using them.
And now there are states where Anna, as a very feminine person, would have to potentially use a male restroom, which is also a huge amount of fear-inducing anxiety of, So whatever the case is, you can't be in a female restroom, you won't feel safe in a male restroom, so why do we have to even differentiate these things?
Yes. So trans-friendly spaces help everyone. Can you imagine if every public restroom was just a single stall where you can go in, do your business, and leave, and you don't have to interact with anybody else? Lovely. Trans inclusion in healthcare makes it more likely for individuals to seek service. Historically, people of marginalized groups, women, trans people, BIPOC folks, have been very, very much discriminated against in the healthcare setting. And that has led to a lot of historic trauma and a lot of cultural trauma about not seeking support when needed from healthcare providers. I think that we are finally getting to a point where we are starting to see a lot more BIPOC folks, trans folks. I mean, a lot of women are working in healthcare, are seeking out healthcare needs. But historically, that has been very bad for a lot of people.
Yeah. The system was developed to support a certain level of wealth and a certain level of understanding of systems and cis white men who created a lot of these systems. So we have to actively work to combat that in order to make people feel safe in our facilities.
And then learning combats ignorance and develops empathy and acceptance. The more you know, the better you can help your patients, the better you can help yourselves, and the better you can help everyone around you. I cannot tell you how often I get messages from parents who are like, your training, the things that I learned here helped me support my trans child, helped me support my trans nephew, my trans sister.
Or I just went out into the world and I felt more comfortable understanding and interacting with other people because all of a sudden it wasn't about our differences, but it was about the fact that you're another human being out there and there's just some language that we need to use in order to be more supportive and understanding. But, wow, this thing is really
sensitive. Okay. I think there's one more before that. Yeah, okay, okay.
Okay, got it.
We're on it. Technical difficulties. So what is gender? Well, so Wikipedia, the dictionary, whatever, will tell you that it's the behavioral, cultural, and psychological traits typically associated with one's sex. I hate this definition, because gender is not definable. It's not something that you can say, this is what it is, this is what it isn't. This hits a lot of the important points, except for the associated with one's sex point, because gender doesn't have to be associated with a sex. Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. But gender really is the internalized feelings that you have about who you are as a person. It is, I am a man. And what does that mean for me? It means that I like to wear a dress outside. And I probably just blew your minds a little bit about like a man wearing a dress.
That doesn't sound like a man to me.
But that is gender. Gender is, I'm a woman and I can wear a blazer, I can go outside, I can look hot as heck. I was asked not to swear. I normally swear a little bit more, so bear with me as I try and come up with more PG. And I feel great because of that. That's gender. Gender can also be, today, I am dressed very femininely, I'm wearing a dress, I've got my makeup done. I am expressing my gender. I'm a woman, and I'm expressing my gender. Not fully a woman, as we'll kind of get into, but I am part of a woman.
There's some other terms. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. Cam is a man.
I've done a lot of gender reflection through this, and I am very content that I am a cisgender man. I may not be the manliest of men in our societal standpoints, but I am content in the fact that I am a masculine presenting cis man.
Yes. Other terms?
Yeah, so some other terms that we just want you to kind of think about. So transgender would be someone who doesn't conform with their sex assigned at birth. So
that'd be me.
That would be you and a lot of people. And we'll show you in a minute, that's a very large continuum. And trans is generally the word we use to just kind of umbrella an entire group of gender non-conforming people. Not everyone who doesn't conform with their gender assigned at birth identifies as trans, but it's the word that we use generally to provide us with something as a point to anchor ourselves on.
This term also doesn't have any cultural or spiritual or anything else specifically attached to it, whereas some other terms that we'll get into, such as two-spirit, have some of those attached to it. AMAB and AFAB just literally translate to assigned male at birth and assigned female at birth. I would say in most settings, you wouldn't hear these terms used frequently. In the medical setting, you may see these quite frequently. And that's because these are ways that trans people talk about how they were told they were supposed to be at birth. A doctor pointed at them and said, you're a man, you're a woman.
And that's where I'll jump down to intersex and say one of the understandings we have is that our society wants a binary. You are a boy or you are a girl. And so in most circumstances, there are intersex people out there who don't necessarily conform to one or the other, but a doctor or their parents or some combination will say, we've decided you're going to be born a boy. And then there might be some procedures that are done to do that, or it may just be societally presenting, depending on the needs. But generally, we put people in one group or the other, if you were intersex.
Do you like to save money? I know I do. That's why I've started using Upside. Upside is an app that gives you cash back on your everyday purchases. I personally save up to 22 cents per gallon on gas, and there are deals for up to 30% back at restaurants. And if you use our offer code, you can save an additional 15 cents per gallon on your first gas purchase and support the Transgenda while you're at it. Just go to upside.com to get the app and use offer code Cameron634 936. That's CAMERON 634 936 to get 15 more cents off when you fill up your tank. Make your dollars go further with cashback from Upside.
Non-binary, agender, and gender fluid. These are all terms that we use to describe people who do not fit into the typical gender binary of male, female, masculine, feminine. Non-binary could be someone like me.
There's a question in the chat, and I thought it would be appropriate to address it right now since we're talking about it, if that's okay. So they asked, can you better explain the term cisgender?
Yes. So cisgender is literally just anyone who isn't trans. So they don't have they are the gender that they were assigned at birth. So Cam, for example, is a cisgender man. He was assigned male at birth. He is a man. He's someone who is masculine presenting, wouldn't really fall under the label of trans in very many ways.
That doesn't mean I can't put on a dress. That doesn't mean that I can't do drag. That doesn't mean, there's lots of weird societal conformity things. But I just feel like my gender aligns with the sex that I was assigned at birth, and that makes me a cis person.
Yes. For me, I'm trans. I was assigned male at birth, but I am a woman. And so they are just opposite terms that mean, goes along with the assigned sex at birth, does not go along with the assigned sex at birth. Hope that answers the question. So non-binary, agender, and gender fluid. Non-binary, someone who isn't a male person, isn't a female person, kind of fits somewhere else in the spectrum, and we'll kind of get into that. Agender, someone who doesn't experience a gender or has very little experience of gender. So they might be a woman, but they are very little woman. They just don't have that experience that comes with
the woman label is not an important part of their existence.
Yes.
We'll see this in a minute with pronouns, but we have a good friend in our world who uses any pronouns.
Yes.
They're just like, I don't experience gender. I wish gender didn't exist. You can call me whatever, and it doesn't matter.
Yep. And then gender fluid is someone who has either multiple genders or flows between the genders in a way that is atypical to how society expects people to experience gender. Yeah.
Where does they, them fit into that?
That might be a pronoun choice for somebody who's non-binary and doesn't necessarily fit a he, him, or a she, her sort of pronoun. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute here.
Yeah. And then two-spirit is a term that is often used in the Native community for folks who have a spiritual, cultural, and other sorts of experiences tied to their gender. We might call them trans. They would technically fit under that label. However, two-spirit is a lot more than what the trans label can really encapsulate. And being not a two-spirit person myself, I don't super feel comfortable to talk a ton about this. Because honestly, we should be listening to people who are two-spirit to hear what they have to say about their own experiences.
But the general definition is most indigenous cultures in the United States had at least a third gender, if not other roles. They had terms specific to their tribe for what that was. And then as a formalized United States community in Canada, they decided that the term two-spirit was a good term in the English language to represent just people of a third gender or other that didn't necessarily fit with conformity in gender based on those cultural practices.
We kind of already went over intersex. So what is gender? This is our next slide,
yep.
Right? Okay. Just want to make sure. So gender, as we think of it, is sort of a spectrum, right? So we've got male, we've got female, and then we've got some lines in between.
And generally, as society, it's binary. We try to put people into this box or that box.
I do not know very many people in my life who fit strictly into the female or strictly into the male box by societal standards. Because society is always changing, and its expectations of what a man or a woman is changes. If we were to look even at the 60s, a woman would be someone who stays home, is cooking, is cleaning, and I don't think that that is really a thing that anybody
really
expects
fit
of a
our
woman.
gender roles as we experience them today. We also know that a lot of the argument for this is, well, I took 8th grade biology, and I know there's XX and there's XY. Well, I assume as medical professionals you understand that there's a lot more chromosomal activity that happens beyond just XX and XY. There's a whole range. There's, what did we say? There's XXX, there's XXY, there's a large, and when we talk about intersex, that's more of a genitalia presenting version of that often, but chromosomally, hormonally, and mentally, we have a broad range, even though we may be presenting very much in one or the other binary.
All right, next slide. So, what is gender a little bit expanded? So this is what we're talking about. So, you might identify fully as a woman, and you might fit most, if not all, of societal standards. But I'd say that most women that I know probably fit somewhere close to here, kind of in the line here, where you're not fully identifying with what society expects of a woman. And that can be either biological, that can be emotional, psychological, whatever. It can be a whole host of things that make you not exactly what society expects a woman to be. Some people might experience one side of it, but still be closer to the middle. So have some femininity, some feminine things, identify a little bit more with the feminine side, but still identify as a man, or still be very masculine. And that's totally okay too. Cam, you love to paint your nails.
I do.
It makes you feel good.
Nails.
I would say that that typically doesn't fall under the strict definition of what we have for a man. But that's all right, because our gender spectrum kind of talks about that a little bit more.
I'm also in community with people that I feel comfortable having painted nails in them. The part of the societal expectations are, in the spaces that we're in, there's not always acceptance of the things that we're talking about, which is why we feel it's so important to go out and say, let's just try to love each other and meet them where they're at, you know? And that's what we want to do with our patients.
So this is kind of getting into, we're upping the ante a little bit. We're moving forward from just the two genders into how do you experience your gender? So you might be very feminine.
Oh, that's right.
Oh yeah,
That was
you might be very feminine, but experience a lot of that femininity. So I think this is kind of where you and I lie on the graph.
I was trying my best to get us to where we were.
Yeah, so like I experience a lot of genders. Like gender to me is a lot of things. I exude energy when I am experiencing and loving my gender. And I'm also pretty feminine. Not all the way feminine, but pretty feminine. Cam doesn't experience as much gender as I do, but that doesn't mean that he doesn't experience a lot of gender. And he is pretty far on the masculine side there. I want you to just think a little bit about where you might put yourself on this scale of like, how much do I really experience my gender?
And so, this might be a time for us to talk about where dysphoria falls in this. And so one of the components of this is like, you might feel especially gender and great when you have the prettiest dress ever. And there's a lot of female presenting people in the room, so I'm edging that direction here, just out of like trying to find a middle line. But you know, like the time that you experience the most gender might be that, or it might be when you're in a hoodie and sweats and, you know, relaxing and hanging out with your kids. This is really, really, really just you and your heart kind of experience here.
Yes.
For trans people, there's this other level of this that if you're not experiencing gender in a way that matches how you feel, then it causes a level of dysphoria.
Yes.
What is dysphoria?
Dysphoria, and I'm using the medical terms here, I'm not, don't take this as, but basically what it means is the thing that trans people experience. The DSM-5 will give you a lot more words for how to get there and stuff, but that's basically the gist of it. I hate the DSM-5, by the way. I did a whole episode dismantling it. It's a really bad document. That's great for medical insurance billing. About it. Yep. But dysphoria is very much this idea that trans people have a mental illness or are unwell because they are trans. And that's not really telling the whole story. Dysphoria is society putting expectations on someone that don't align with what their expectations for themselves are. So for me, when I was expected to be masculine, play soccer, go out and wear like shorts and get dirty in the mud and stuff, I was like, no, that's not me. I want to go and play with dolls. And that was not expected of me. You know, the expectation was I go play soccer. I'm not putting this on camera.
No. I was doing what I thought needed to be done as a parent of an assigned male at birth person.
And so when we're talking about trans people, we're talking about people who experience a different set of expectations than what society put on them. That's not to say that dysphoria isn't useful. Dysphoria is a very useful tool to measure how trans people are being affected by these mixed expectations. The way that I would advocate for, though, is euphoria. Euphoria is a term that's now coming into light in the trans community as a way to describe trans people's good experiences. So no longer are we talking about, oh, I'm so sad because I was assigned male at birth, but I'm a woman, to simplify it a lot. Instead, euphoria is, I get to be a woman, and I am so excited about that. You know, that's the feeling. It's that feeling that when you get a nice dress, and you put it on, and you're like, I feel hot right now. I feel pretty. I feel like myself. That's euphoria.
Or I went to the store today and someone called me sir, and it's a trans man who, you know, until then had been very feminine presenting, and that is euphoric for them. Like, yes, I'm finally being recognized in the world as the person I am, is what my identity is.
And the other reason why we're moving to a euphoria model as opposed to a dysphoria model is because cisgender people can experience euphoria too. If you are so happy in your experience as a woman today, or your experience as a man, and you're like, I feel like I am the manliest man, or the womanliest woman, or I feel content in how I am today, that's gender euphoria. That's something that you can experience, that trans people also experience. And so it makes it a little more relatable, and something that is a little easier to understand for people who aren't trans, who don't understand all the complexities.
One more thing is, all of the things we're talking about are fluid. So you might start in this quadrant and feel great here, and then eventually through time and trying to process who you are as a human being, which I feel is extremely important for all of us to do, you may move into another quadrant, and that's okay. It's just really hard, and we recognize as we move to how you do this as medical professionals, that the systems that are in place very much put people in single boxes, and the idea of any fluidity that people would show up and have a different set of pronouns or a different name any given time that they come and see you is probably the most complex part of this, both for how we understand each other in society and also the systems that you're working with to provide support for your patients.
Okay, yeah, this is a good one to go on. So what are pronouns? Pronouns are the subjective, objective, and possessive pronouns. Subject, object, and possessive pronouns used to reflect a person's gender identity. So for a lot of people, that might be she, her, that might be he, him. Oftentimes they, them is also being used fairly frequently now. That has happened kind of in the last 10 years, I would say.
It lives in traditional because one thing we talk about a lot is professional writing and media up until about 1940 actually tended to use they, them when discussing the subject as opposed to he, him, or she, her. You'll see that if you go back and read articles. It was just a formality in writing that was more common. Only in the last, since then, has it become confusing for us to think of an individual person as they, them, and not a group of people. But I always say, when you get struggling with that, if you didn't know, if I had my back turned and maybe long hair and you didn't know my gender, what would you default to? Would you just say, he, and try to find that? Or would you say they, which I think is what we commonly tend to do if we don't know what somebody's gender is? Or if you literally just are talking about somebody in the world and you don't know what their gender is, you tend to use they, them, instead of assuming a he, her, or she, her. Why do I keep saying that?
He, her.
Let's go with that.
Neopronouns, I hate the term neo. It means new in Greek. And it's very misleading because neopronouns are not new. They have been used since the beginning of written history. But they're new to the English language. They are new to people who are used to they, them, he, him, and she, her. I use neopronouns. You may have seen that. I use they, their. They, their to me is coming from the Celtic fairies who are mischievous little creatures who kind of run around the forest and do little mischievous things like take someone's socks. And I think of myself a lot in that.
But she's going to take your socks.
I'm going to take your socks. Everybody check your shoes. No. Everyone on the Zoom, I'm coming to your house and taking your socks.
It's an individual service we provide.
It costs extra though. No. But that's my experience of neopronouns. Someone else might use fair pronouns and not have that connection to the fairies. It's all individual.
And again, this may sound very, out of context, out of the realm of things that you think about on a day-to-day basis, but one thing I want to say is the English language only has so many words in it.
Yes.
And so what we're doing as people trying to express our gender is find the closest word to the expression that we have for ourselves. And that's where the idea of, fair or identify as a toaster or whatever it is, as long as that's being used in a thoughtful way to just say that's the closest scenario I've got and not I'm a bigot and I, have decided I'm going to be a toaster today. That's, there's a difference here, but it's about supporting the idea that this is the closest language we have for the thing that Anna experiences.
Yes. I just want to go over really quick how to pronounce these pronouns because these are pretty common neopronouns that you might see in your professional day. So fey, fair, fairs, you may see fey, fays, fays, as well. It just kind of depends on how they want to use that. Z, here is another one that you might see. And then Z, zem, zir, is how you pronounce that last one. So you may see these in your professional life, especially as trans people come across and come up with new pronouns. And it's always okay to ask your patient, ask your people in your life, how do I pronounce your pronouns? What are your pronouns? How do I pronounce your name? What is your name? Those are all okay questions.
And knowing that we're getting a little over
time, I think we can
get
skip
to
this one.
We just want to quick say that there's another quadrant, and that is not only how we express our gender, but what words we use to help you express our gender using words.
Yes.
That's where that comes from. The other thing we want to quick talk about is the idea of the T in LGBTQ, that gender and sexuality are not aligned. It's not the same thing, but they live within the same idea of how we assist people in the world.
Please, if you get the chance, look up the gender unicorn. And a good activity that you all should partake in is trying to put yourself where you think you are on the gender unicorn's scales here. It's a really fun activity that can be super thoughtful.
So I present not very much feminine, but I present a lot masculine and maybe a little fairy. I'm physically attracted to women. I'm a little bit physically attracted to men, not quite as much, but I have huge amounts of emotional attraction to all humans. This is not an either or. This is a scale because that's actually how we live in the real world. There's a lot of continuum in the way that we express ourselves, who we love and who we're attracted to.
Exactly.
Can you explain a little bit more about what emotionally attracted means?
Emotionally attracted is, so physically attracted is someone who you want to have sex with, who you want to cuddle with, who you want to be physically close to. Emotional attraction is who you want to spend your time with, who you want to share in the moments that are hard, who you want to share in the moments that are good, who you want to have with you maybe as a life partner.
And you might have a crush on somebody who you don't want to have sex with. That would be the clearest example of that, I'm not physically attracted to you, but your energy, the way that you come off is extremely attractive.
You pass my vibe check would be a good way to say that.
All right. So this is the crux of the presentation, the things we really want to leave you with.
So, what name and pronouns would you like me to use for you today? Perfectly good question to ask everyone. Doesn't matter if they have trans in their case notes, doesn't matter if they are, the burliest manly man who, is wearing, a MAGA shirt. Doesn't matter. Always ask, what name and pronouns would you like me to use for you today? If you feel safe doing so. I want to make sure that you all feel safe in doing this, too. If you do not feel physically safe to ask someone these questions, it is okay to just go off of what the medical record says. But I encourage you to think about these questions, because people can surprise you, and just because that person maybe you wouldn't expect to be trans, they may still be. What do you need to feel safe and respected today? Great question. Especially for someone who maybe just gave birth to our birthing people, maybe someone who is hospitalized for a problem that's going on that they need some constant care for. How do you need to feel safe and respected today is a great question.
Might be the one to start with that helps you lead into name and pronouns based on what kind of response they give you.
Yes. Please, please, please don't make assumptions about people's genitalia. If you will be performing an exam of the genitals, ask. And that should go without saying for a lot of you, but please always ask, before you do any exam, anything like that. Just, hey, I need to look at this part of you. Is it okay if I do that? This is what I need to do. What am I looking at? What should I be looking for here?
Many trans people don't ever want gender-affirming surgery.
Yes.
And many do, but you can't assume one way or the other.
Yes. And then take steps to respect the trans patient's needs as much as possible. So this could be using their name and pronouns in the room with them when they are safe, like when you feel safe to do so. It might be not using their preferred name and pronouns around certain caregivers who might be coming around. It might be adjusting your medical notes so that you start the night off and meet the insurance needs of this patient's name is this thing and they use these pronouns, and then later you say, actually, they have told me that they use this name and pronouns. However you need to meet the insurance, however you need to document it, but just try your best to support and affirm your patients. And harmful behaviors. Misgendering and misnaming without correcting yourself is really bad. However, that's a double-edged sword, because if you do correct yourself and you're like, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry.
Yeah, to make it the end of the world and all about you, oh, I can't believe I did that. Just correct yourself and move on.
Yes. If you need to say sorry, correct yourself, move on. That's all that's needed. Gender-related medical misattribution and invasive questioning, also known as trans broken arm syndrome. You may hear this. I go into the emergency room with a broken arm. The doctor's like, have you had the surgery? What hormones are you on? How much of these hormones are you taking a day?
Did you break your arm because you're trans?
Yeah.
No.
No.
No, I just broke my arm.
Hey, do you need to know my drug interactions? Sure, I'll tell you what hormones I'm on and stuff. But do you need to know that I'm taking this amount of estrogen a day because I broke my arm? Not really, unless we're talking about an osteoporosis situation, not super relevant. So just keep your questions relevant. Outing a trans patient to others without necessity or explicit consent. This doesn't have to even be the parent of the patient. This doesn't even have to be a caregiver of the patient. This could be to the provider. This could be to other nurses. Ask your patient who they feel comfortable coming out to, if they come out to you. Because it might be that they feel comfortable with you, but not with Stephanie, who sits next to you.
Sorry, Steph.
Sorry, Stephanie. I forgot you were back there. Just came up with a name off the top of my head. So, just be aware of that too. And then any comments that are political in nature about gender or asking questions like, what's it like to be trans?
If you have that kind of rapport and relationship and you feel but 99% of the time it is just not, in your circumstances as caregivers, it's not going to be good.
You really want to be mindful of those power dynamics, and especially with trans people's history in the medical system, asking them what's it like to be trans can be a little bit jarring for them. So just be really aware of that. And some resources. So Trans Northland, as I mentioned, I'm the co-chair. We offer a lot of resources to local trans people and information about how to work with trans folks.
Transforming Families, I'm on the board of directors for. They're an organization out of the Twin Cities that provides specific assistance and gathering groups for parents of trans kids and for trans kids to provide that level of support and resource.
And then Hopkins Center for Transgender Health. Excellent resource for if you have any medical related questions about trans folks.
I was going to give you Mayo, but I felt like maybe that was kind of a conflict. So Mayo and John Hopkins are at the bleeding edge of research on trans medicine. So
yes. And then also our email and website. You're welcome to use those as resources as well. Reach out. But now we're going to get into a Q&A here. We've got about 20 minutes, right?
No, about 5 or 10.
About 5 to 10 minutes. Okay. My brain is not working today. So, questions. Ask them. I want to hear the down and dirty. I want to answer the questions that are bleeding in your brain that don't stroke out though. Yeah.
Can you give an example of a common disrespect or error that medical people can make that we shouldn't make?
Yes. Something that is so often done is either misgendering or dead naming or something like that is pretty common, even when you know that person's preferred pronouns and name. However, I'd say that a more common one is just to make assumptions, honestly. Like, I've had assumptions made about myself, I've had assumptions made about my body, about who I am because I'm trans. I had a doctor one time who I was getting care for being trans, like I was getting hormones, and she was like, have you had a hysterectomy? And I'm like, nope.
That's not actually going to be physically possible. Right. Yeah. So, but I would say that happens less than the opposite, which is, okay, a doctor gets your name and pronouns correct, but then proceeds for the rest of the procedure to treat you as you're assigned, at birth without really thinking about asking any questions of you. Like, what are you on hormones, or, what genitals, if that's relevant to whatever exam is happening, just to sort of charge in with, like, I know this person was male assigned at birth, and so I'm going to do all my treatment accordingly without thinking about any complexities about their gender experience.
That is a very common thing that happens as well, unfortunately.
The other thing, I don't remember why I didn't have it up there, but there's often dysphoria about certain parts of body, especially genitalia. So just examining without really being conscientious of, like, how somebody feels about their body parts, I think that's, again, for any human being that can be the case. So just apply that same kind of empathy to this individual circumstance of, like, I might not like to think about my genitals at all because that's dysphoric to me. And so having you examine that is going to be really challenging for my thing.
For some of you who might work with SA survivors and things like that, it can be a very similar experience. Not the same. I'm never going to say that it's the same experience, but it can be very similar, of like a lot of sensitivity, a lot of wanting to avoid the subject, wanting to just be very cautious about how you're talking about that. Yeah, please.
Question in the chat. I sometimes have questions regarding transgender issues, but I'm afraid to ask them for fear of being disrespectful or hurtful. So I say or ask nothing. Any questions or any suggestions?
Email us.
Yeah, email us. Yeah, no, please look it up online if you can. Something that can be very hard, like challenging for providers is you don't necessarily want to ask your patient the questions that you have. Unless they are medically relevant, try and keep your questions to a minimum to them about, like, what their experience is, things like that. They'll share that if they want to. If you have, like, a medical question that you don't really know the answer for, the patient might not know the answer for, it might be disrespectful to ask them, you can also ask your colleagues, see if they might have an answer, talk to your supervisors. Like, there might be some ways to, like, answer this question without necessarily just resorting to Google. But yeah, definitely be cautious and aware of how you and when you're asking your patients questions that they may or may not have the answer to, but it might be disrespectful to ask them regardless.
One common thing we talk about in protection of marginalized communities is that often marginalized communities are asked to do all of the emotional and support labor to teach those who don't have that identity everything. So, my one BIPOC friend, I need to have them explain to me all of the, experiences and how I can be better about being, more racially sensitive or culturally sensitive, or someone with a disability. Like, oh my gosh, how do you experience the world? And what we learn is that that's a lot of emotional toll on people who are in marginalized communities who already are experiencing a lot of emotional toll from society. So there's no easy answer to this other than look for resources outside of the one individual that you know who's experienced marginalized situations in their life and try to find answers elsewhere. And there are lots of, again, we're a resource. We have some things on our blog available. We don't always answer questions that come to our email because we get a little inundated with it, but we definitely will take those questions and bring them to the podcast. So that's another place that you can get some information. And I appreciate the way the question was framed because, yeah, you should be sensitive to how and what you're asking people. I think that's appropriate.
Yes. Yeah.
I don't know exactly what kind of question I'm trying to ask here, but I don't have any questions necessarily about like the emotional piece of how do you support somebody who's just like this is who they are and how they're, but in terms of like some of the more complex medical things, when I'm thinking about like we sit and learn all about the risk factors of like if you're a woman or you're a Caucasian woman or if you're a Hispanic woman versus if you're a man versus a woman, there are some really clear differences in terms of I mean, even when we look at a normal hemoglobin level, they're different from a man and a woman. So in that sense, I'm trying to figure out like how we're sensitive to that of if you're coming in and you're identifying one way, but your sex at birth is a different way, how do I treat that, being mindful of that your risk factors might be more towards.
Well, and let me say, layer hormone treatment on top of that. You might have a higher risk factor for prostate cancer and breast cancer because of the hormonal balance. So,
and that part that I feel like my brain is really having a hard time getting wrapped around. Like, how can I be sensitive to making sure that I'm providing effective care?
Yes. Most trans people are aware of their risk factors. We are told very, very thoroughly and often and consistently about what our risk factors are. So, like, I'm on progesterone, which is a hormone, and that increases my risk of breast cancer. I'm aware of that. I'm also a medical provider, so I'm, like, maybe a little more aware of it than, say, a lay trans person. But because of the system that we have built to basically prevent trans people from getting care, the barriers that are in place oftentimes are also helpful in some ways. Of like, a lot of trans people understand the risks that come along with transitioning because it's drilled into our heads so thoroughly.
I'm not necessarily thinking about the transition. I'm thinking about just, you come in and you're hypertension, that sort of thing. Like, how do I ask those questions that maybe would feel a little bit more like they're based off of your gender from birth versus how you identify in this more.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Something that I was taught when I was working on the ambulance was to always ask before we gave anybody nitroglycerin if they were taking any Viagra or something like that. And I think just being aware that people can take different things for different reasons. People have different pre-existing conditions and stuff. And so asking your patient might be a good thing there. If you are concerned about something like that, talking to another provider might be a really good idea. Or again, using resources online like Johns Hopkins, Mayo, something like that.
But I would say, we can't speak for every single trans person, just like we can't speak for every cis person about how they react to how you approach things. Most trans people that we know are going to come in, and if you say, okay, because you were assigned male at birth, hypertension is a concern, and then leave it at that. Like, it doesn't need to be any further, just that's the concern, and that's the reason why we're going this direction. I think most trans people are not going to feel sensitivity to that. They're just going to say, I know. I know I'm assigned male at birth.
So, your differentials, right? They do conform to some degree.
Yes.
Yeah, well, and, something else to keep in mind, too, is, I look very feminine. If you were to completely undress me, I would be a woman standing in front of you. I've had surgeries, I've had hormone treatment for a while now, and, I would be a woman. If I were in a really bad car accident, came into the ICU, and I was a Jane Doe, right? You wouldn't necessarily have that information. And so it's really cool that we can get that information, but it's not necessarily something that is always available. And so, working with the information that you have too. If hypertension is a concern, that should be something that you should be aware of.
Right.
If it's not a concern, then something like that too. And that's not to say that you shouldn't be doing your job. You shouldn't be.
No, but if we have the more information we have, something more helpful.
Better. You never know what's going to come out of the Yeah. No, your question is apt and correct, and there's no easy answer to it.
There really is.
But as with kind of the underline for the whole thing, as much communication as you can do with your patient to feel those things out. They may stonewall you, because they just really feel dysphoric about, and so you may just have to keep those things in the back of your mind and not be able to, like you would, again, an SA survivor who just might not tell, they might not open out about these things. There's so many scenarios where somebody's going to walk into your office and not feel comfortable, giving you the answers that you need.
Well, the beginning of your presentation where you said, be aware of how you're coming into the office feeling, they're on the defense. That was really helpful for me, because I get that with an SA patient, if I know that they're on the defense, right? But I guess that didn't really necessarily register for me of understanding that.
even as a cis white man, I grew up without health insurance, and so I didn't access medical care until I was in my late 20s for the first time, and I came in the defensive. I was like, oh my gosh, it's going to be so expensive, and everybody's going to screw me over, and I know better now, having been part of the system for a while, and thank goodness I'm being treated for the things I need to be treated for, but I think we all come at this with a challenging, perspective on the world, and so the same tools that you use to support your patients all the time are the tools you're going to use to support your patients.
Well, another thing to keep in mind too, sorry that we're fixating on this question, it's just a really good question, is I might have different risk factors than someone who just started HRT. And so because I've been, HRT is hormone replacement therapy, and so, because I've been on hormones for years now, my risk of hypertension is probably a little bit lower than someone who just started on hormones or assisted.
Yeah, that's what I mean. Just having some of that information would be really helpful in providing care. But how do we, how do you tactfully ask that so that we don't make somebody more on the defense?
Something like, how long have you been on hormones? Are you on hormones? Something like that is so easy to ask, and I'm almost certain that 90% of trans people are going to be, I've been on hormones for this long. Because a lot of us understand, even though we have that cultural and historic trauma, a lot of us understand too that you need to do your job. So, yeah. Okay.
Steph, I don't want to go over our time here. I know they need a break, but.
Good. I do have one question.
Yeah, please.
So we have had a situation up at the birthing center where we had parents who didn't want to assign gender to their child.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. But in order to do a birth certificate, you have to do that. How do we help them, with that dilemma? And do you think there'd ever be a time where that changes?
I sure hope so. I think that time may be coming soon, depending on how the future plays out with everything going on. But I would love to get to a point where you don't have to put down a gender for the birth certificate. Right now, though, just explaining to them that this is something that is out of my control, out of anyone's control, really. It has to be done. I work as a case manager now, and that is something that I have to do pretty much every day. Is why are we doing this? Well, it's because this really poopy thing, told me to do it this way. I had one slip up.
You were so close to the end here.
Thank you.
So there are three kinds of transition typically. There's a social transition, there's a medical transition, and there's the the government transition that you have. And each of those has their own complexities, so what we're talking about is a government transition, and unfortunately at that transition will maybe have to happen if the person decides that they're not the gender assigned at birth, because our current government systems require them to be one or the other. Not everywhere in the world is that the case. There are gender non-conforming markers that can be on certificates, but we don't have access to that in our world right now.
And thankfully, Minnesota allows for IDs to be self-disclosed, so you can put male, female, or X on your driver's license, which is a really good way that we have started to work in the right steps here, but birth certificates, social security cards, things like that, those are just going to take time to fix.
But support them in saying it's okay for you not to, you're going to have a sex, and that's on your birth certificate, but you don't need to have a gender. We're not going to codify that in any way in our system. They will be they, them, as we treat you and this new child.
Or whatever pronouns they use.
So just keep it simple. This is the sex of birth, and how can I refer to your baby?
Exactly. That's perfect.
And keep it
How can I refer to your baby? This is the sex that we have to put on the birth certificate because this is the system that we're in.
And this is a number of our friends just gave birth recently, and they all have gender non-conforming kids because they're like, I don't want to tell them who they are until they are old enough to make that decision. I wish that was something that I had available to me in my world as a young parent of Anna, because I think her world would have been a little eeasier.
It would have been. I had to wait 3 years for my social security card to come in after I changed my name. So, the world is bad.
It's hard.
All right.
I think we'll wrap on that. Yeah, thank you all so much for your great questions and for having us.
Thank you.